as promised, here we are. We are back with another set of slides and another little lecture on, this time, sight. So we're working through the senses, and we're going to relate the senses then to basically wine tasting ultimately, but remember that this can be applied to other things as well. But let's take maybe an in-depth look at our sense of sight. So I think, though I guess I'm not sure because I haven't seen you all, that most of us, or all of us, have sight to some degree. I know for myself, I have to wear glasses, so my sight physiologically isn't as good as perhaps others. However, technology and also my brain has compensated for that, and I am now able to see quite well, thank you. So let's talk about sight and what it is and how it applies to wine tasting and other things as well. So it's interesting. Think about being in a world without sight. We saw the Daniel Kish video, and he, I think, does quite well for it. However, it is something that we rely on a lot, and in fact, for most of us, I would say it's probably the most important sense that we have in many ways. It is how we navigate the world on a daily basis, almost constantly. Perhaps touch would be another one that's just as important, but sight certainly is right up there. What's really interesting is that we're not really well trained in it. So we haven't put ourselves to task, for the most part, in terms of using our sense of sight. In other words, how well can we see and how well do we pay attention? Again, there's that key, pay attention to what it is that our eyes are perceiving, at least in normal usage. So let's continue a little bit. And one of the things that we want to do here is kind of establish maybe a framework for understanding our senses, and specifically for understanding how our senses perceive our environment. So we've identified three basic, we'll say functions, or functions isn't quite the right word, but rather aspects maybe of a sense that we want to look at a little bit closer. And they will be the source, in other words, where does it come from, the receptor, how do we receive it, and then finally the processor, how do we interpret or make sense of that sense after it's received. So we'll step through this on sight, and we'll do it for each of the senses actually, just to kind of give a framework and a bit of an understanding about how the brain works in terms of perceiving the environment around us through our senses. So with sight, the source is, of course, light, or maybe it's not so obvious. And if we think about, like, well, what sources of light are there? There's one major one, the sun. There also are stars. Then the next, I would say, common natural source would be lightning bugs around here, and fire. Let's put fire up there maybe first, and then lightning bugs, because lightning bugs kind of go away this time of the year. So fire is one, and also like electrical spark. Now, we see a lot of things, and we have a lot of different lights, but a lot of these are man-made, and so, like the room I'm sitting in has an incandescent, well, actually I guess it's a fluorescent light. So it's electrical, and we've learned through technology to convert electricity into light, and so we can see it. And so that light bulb emits light in this room, and I can see the walls because it is reflecting the light from that light bulb back to my eyes. The computer screen that's in front of me is also a source of light. It is emitting light, and it is also being received by my eyes. What's interesting is, think about, let's see, like a shadow. What you're really seeing is the absence of light. So you see something white, and you don't see something behind it. That's because the blackness is actually a shadow. There's no light being emitted. So we see that as not seeing something, and usually we have to have a border of light around it in order to make sense of not being able to see it, to give it form. So this is all kind of how light works for us. It's either emitted or reflected, and based on those two properties, we see it. What is it that we see with? Well, of course, the obvious answer is our eyes. And at the back of our eyes, you can see the little diagram there of the bisected eye. There is the retina, and the retina is actually what has the receptor cells located on it, and as light strikes them, basically what happens is a slight little chemical reaction occurs within that cell, and it creates an electrical charge, which gets fired along the optic nerve and goes to the processor in the brain. So the processor is what makes sense of these little, actually not quite random, but these firings of electrical impulses from the retina. And the occipital lobe in the brain, which is located at the back of the brain, actually looks at these or takes these electrical impulses, the pattern, really, of them, and turns it into an image that we see. And not just an image, but also a color of the image. So we get basically some pretty cool information. We get form, and we also get color out of that. So this is how the eye functions in terms of our sense of sight. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go on to the next slide. And what we have here is color. And so I've talked a little bit about color, and color is actually quite interesting for the human. So our eyes have the ability to determine different colors, and in fact, we can make about 300,000 judgments about color. Now, we clearly don't have 300,000 words for each individual color, but in other words, if we have two colors that are very close together, we can look at them and say, yes, I see a difference. That's kind of what we're talking about here. We may not be able to put a name to it, so maroon might be a pretty wide range of different colors that all kind of fall into that area of maroon. And it would be very distinct from yellow-green, which kind of went the other way. You know, I always like to think about, as a kid, one of the coolest things in the world was to see the big box of crayons. And I think, was it 64 different colors? And they had like yellow-green and green-yellow. And we'd always kind of go, well, what's the difference between yellow-green and green-yellow? You know, but they look different. We could see it. But the name was just kind of bizarre. So this is, that was just 64 colors, you know, and we were like, wow, man, this is so cool. Can't believe all these colors. We can do anything with them. And that's just a tiny fraction of what our eyes really have the capability of determining or discerning. So in other words, our eyes are actually pretty good when it comes to color. Now, some of us are colorblind, which means that we have perhaps some differences, we'll say, in actually determining colors compared to someone else. Most of people who have that have ways to compensate, or you know, they see blue and it's gray, and all blue is gray or something like that. There's various permutations of it. But ultimately, we can talk about color, and most people recognize it and see it. And we can further take color and define it into two different aspects even further. So one of them is the hue, and the hue is the actual color itself. And we'll talk about this more. And then the other one is saturation. And saturation refers to the depth of color. In other words, how intense is the color? How much color is really there? So let's look at some examples here. Okay, so we're talking about hue and saturation. And across the top, I've got 4 little ovals. And basically, these are made up of 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. Now, with Microsoft, you can go into their little color picker thing, and it's kind of cool because there's a wheel, or there's, you know, various ways of doing it. There's numbers also with red, blue, and yellow assigned to them, and you can add in X amount of color of red, X amount of blue, and X amount of yellow, and create all different kinds of colors. I suppose if we did the math, and I don't remember what the upper limits are, but 155 sticks in my head for the color range, 0 to 155. So if we take that, we could do the math and find out just exactly how many gradations Microsoft is really letting us use. It's not 300,000, I don't think. I think it's less than that. But it still is more than we probably ever need. So what I did going across the top was I took yellow, and then I added some blue and red into it in just small increments. And you can see that, for most of us anyways, I bet, you can see a change in color going across the top. And that represents 4 different hues. Now, at the bottom, I have 4 more ovals, and if you look at them, they kind of have the same color, because the hue is the same. What I have done is increase the saturation going from left to right. So I've just added more color in to it, each going across. And so this represents saturation, or how deep the color is. And so both hue and saturation have application in terms of wine evaluation. Hue, for example, will give us all sorts of information about the grape variety. And saturation tells us also a lot about flavor. So, for example, I can give you a little bit of maybe a story about this, or to illustrate it. And it has to do with, well, I guess both hue and saturation. So, when I was young, my favorite Kool-Aid was cherry Kool-Aid. So, what color is cherry Kool-Aid? Well, it's bright red, of course. All right. So, first of all, I could look at Kool-Aid and go, oh, it's purple. I don't like that. That's great. What I like is red Kool-Aid. Oh, there's cherry. It's my favorite. And then it was kind of curious because my mother made Kool-Aid, and she would take a packet of Kool-Aid mix, dump it into the pitcher, add the amount of water, and add the sugar that was required because it needed sugar back then, and it made good Kool-Aid. But I'd like to go to my best friend's house because when his mother did it, she would take 2 packets of Kool-Aid and she would add it to the pitcher with the proper amount of sugar and the same amount of water that one would add for 1 packet of Kool-Aid. And I liked it better. Why? Well, think about it. All right, so it's got twice as much Kool-Aid mix in it. The color was deep red in it. All right, so right there I thought, wow, this is so cool, man. It's got this color in it. This is what I want. And it had more flavor. So what's the importance of saturation at this point? Because we're talking about saturation, really. It indicates the depth of flavor. In other words, the more flavor, usually the darker it is. Let's think about red wine. You've got this inky black red wine in front of you, lots of color. Is it going to be full flavored? You bet, for the most part. If it isn't, it kind of creates a little bit of a train wreck in our head because we look at it and go, wow, deep color. We may not even say this to ourselves, but our brain is going, wow, deep color, lots of flavor. And if we taste it and it tastes like water, we're just going to go, oh, this is horrible. This is bad. This is not worth anything. Because the visual aspect did not match the flavor. And so in this way, sight sets us up for expectation, really. It gives us all these clues, like the first thing we see when we see the wine is, for the most part, the color of it, the saturation of it. And the brain says, oh, I know what to expect. And if the brain then tastes it and says, this is exactly what I thought it was going to be. This, by the way, this dialogue of the brain goes on, for the most part, unspoken. You know, it just happens in the back of our head. But the response and the reaction that we have is based on that. That's that conditioning going on there. So the brain says, oh, you know, I expected a lot of flavor out of this dark red. This isn't a good red. So their expectation from that visual sense, we call it visual flavor, didn't quite match up. And we'll talk about how this all comes together after we talk about each individual sense. I mean, it relates to balance. I'll put that out there. But this is kind of what we're talking about. This like the expectation. How does visual aspect help us in terms of wine quality? So let's look a little bit more about color in wine. So where does it come from? Well, grape variety. All right. So some grapes are green. Some grapes are kind of a bluish black color. Red wine comes from bluish black grapes. White wine comes from both green grapes and bluish black grapes if they're handled properly. So like white Zinfandel or even a Blanc de Noir sparkling wine made out of blue grapes. And white wine made out of green grapes or blue grapes. And then red wines have to come from blue grapes because that's where the color is. So color then comes from, it was determined by grape variety. Also maturity of fruit. So the riper that fruit gets, the more flavor and more color it tends to have. You can kind of illustrate this by thinking about, for example, an apple. All right. So an apple that's not quite ripe is kind of a yellowish green color, maybe. And then as it ripens, the red starts to develop, and it gets more and more intense. And finally, we get to the point where we go, oh, it's got nice color, and it has good fruit, so good flavor. Climate also helps with color, mostly by affecting maturity of fruit, as does fermentation techniques. So this one is pretty straightforward. If you ferment on the skins and there's color in the skins, then you pull the color out. This is the technique for making red wine. If you separate the juice from the skins without much maceration, or in other words, without chewing the skins up too much to break them down, you can get a very light colored juice. In other words, no pigments. And this is how they make Blanc de Noir, so that kind of white sparkling wine made out of Pinot Noir. So fermentation then helps you to maybe give a little bit less color to the wine. White Zinfandel is made from the same grapes as red Zinfandel. The difference is they don't let the skin contact happen with white Zin, so they get less color. Likewise, aging techniques affects color, and for the most part, what we're talking about here is barrel aging. So barrels, as wine ages in it, the brown color tends to be extracted from the barrel, and so it gives a little bit of a brownish hue. In other words, it increases saturation a little bit, and this becomes important for color then when we get into certain types of wines. What else does color tell us? Well, how about oxidation or freshness? And let's think again, let's use apples as an example. If you take an apple and you cut it in half, and you set half of it down on the counter, and you eat the other half, and then the phone rings and you go away and you talk for a while, and you come back, maybe half hour, 45 minutes later, till you get to your other half of an apple that was sitting on the counter, and you look at it and go, oh, it doesn't look good anymore. Why? It turned brown. Right? It oxidized. And wine also oxidizes. It turns brown. And it doesn't taste the same as when it's fresh. Much the same way that an oxidized brown apple doesn't taste as good as a fresh apple. So that browning color kind of sets us up and says, oh, this white wine's a little bit brown. And we taste it, and perhaps it's not quite as fresh and vibrant as we expect. Now, this could be related to age. So as wine ages, it tends to take on brown color. It can also be, though, and this is where it gets tricky, that it can also be mishandled, so it got too much oxygen content. So it could be a young wine that just wasn't made well, and therefore it shows some oxidation. Or maybe the grapes were too old, they weren't fresh anymore, and we picked up oxidation from that. So there are many things that can kind of play into this in terms of this oxidation, this browning that we tend to see in wine sometimes. Likewise, and we've mentioned this before, kind of the extract and intensity. In other words, having more extract in the wine, so more skin contact, more flavor components and color components leached out of the skin itself gives more intensity of flavor. And our brain automatically makes that association, and it sets us up for the wine to taste in that way. So this is another way that color affects it. And finally, we've got some other visual indicators that aren't related to color. We've talked a lot about that, but this would be more just like things that we see in the wine. For example, clarity and turbidity. In other words, if you have a wine that is clear, or you have a wine that is hazy, which one's more enjoyable, or which one is more preferable, maybe is a better way to say it. Usually, we want to see a nice, clear wine without any turbidity, without any kind of junk floating around in it. So we tend to look at the wine, and if it's nice and clear, then that sets us up for the next expectation that the wine's going to be good. And one of the terms that we use for clarity is brightness. And you'll hear terms like star bright, or it's crystal clear, or different things like that as ways to really kind of indicate like how bright or brilliant is the wine. So these are things that ways that we can describe it. And we'll talk a little bit about descriptors when we get together in that way. Another aspect of visual indicators would be gassiness. In other words, are there bubbles in there? And you can have two scenarios here. One is that you pour the wine into a glass, and the bubbles start forming, and it gets a nice head on it, and everyone gets all excited and goes, "Wow, sparkling wine or champagne, we're so excited." The other is, "Oh my gosh, this wine is spoiled. It's fermenting in the bottle," and which is true. Which can be the case, either one of them, and depending on the winemaker's intent. If the winemaker set out to make sparkling wine, then gas is desirable. If the winemaker did not want sparkling wine, then gas is not desirable. So from this perspective, gassiness can be either good or bad, depending on what the intent is. To illustrate this, I did a tasting one time. It was a blind tasting with students. And it was just a mixed bag. We were doing what we call flights, and a flight is basically 4 wines. I think we were doing at that time 5 wines maybe, that wine people would taste at one time. And oftentimes they're, like if it's a competition, they would rate them, and when you're doing a whole bunch of wines, they give you different flights, and you do all the whites or all the wines in that particular flight together. Or a flight might be, you have 5 different Chardonnays that you're comparing or tasting, and so you would have 5 wines put in front of you. So this is what we were doing, different flights. And I had one flight where I put in a sparkling wine, and I didn't tell them it was sparkling. Half the students rated the wine as exceptional because it was sparkling, and it scored it accordingly. The other half declared the wine was faulted because it was fermenting in the bottle and had gone bad. Who was right? Well, in this case, I would say neither one of them really, because they were not told ahead of time whether it was supposed to be gassy or not. And so those who had the perception that it was gassy, because it was supposed to be a sparkling wine, rated it accordingly. And those who were not expecting the gassiness rated it according to that. So you could say, well, they were both right because they were just using a different set of criteria, both of which could be valid given the fact that they were not given the information about the intentional gassiness of the wine. So this comes back to perception. It's like, how do you see it? And what are you looking for? So this is where the brain plays a big role. The last thing I have here are legs. And legs are kind of interesting. Wine people tend to talk about legs, and it's something you can see right away. There will be a video that you can watch that talks all about how legs form and what they are. But basically, let's just say that it has to do with alcohol content and viscosity. And it's kind of a visual indicator of that. As the alcohol increases, the legs start to form more. And so in this way, then, legs become very important, kind of. Let's just say that they're attractive and fun. But they don't really tell us a whole lot in certain ways. But they are there. People will talk about them, so let's make it known what they are. Also an important part of the visual indicators. So this brings us, hopefully, to a point where we can appreciate, if nothing else, our sense of sight and how it applies to wine, and then at the same time realize that there's a whole lot more that we can do when we start looking at wine. So pay attention to it. When you get a glass in front of you, pay attention. What are you really seeing, and what are you looking for? And also, does the expectation that's created by the visual aspect, in other words, when you look at it, does it taste like what you're expecting it to be based on the appearance? It kind of goes back to that. Is it a sparkling wine or is it a spoiled wine? In other words, what is the visual part tell you, and how important is that into your sensory enjoyment of the wine? So that's kind of your off the record assignment. I think, pay attention, I guess is what I would say it is. And you can do this with food as well. Food, anything. You look at it. Does the flavor meet the expectation of the visual flavor? That's the assignment. And so we'll pick up again with the next lecture. We'll talk about our sense of, smell, I think, is next. Another good one, and also one that's important in wine as well. So let's continue on with that.